Dr. Jonathan Wallace stood in his luxurious office, a sanctuary of polished mahogany and stainless steel, a testament to his success as one of the most esteemed surgeons in the city. The walls were adorned with framed accolades and photographs from prestigious events, each a reminder of his unwavering dedication to his career. Yet behind the facade of brilliance and accomplishment lay an icy indifference that had come to define him. As he adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored shirt, he glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking sound almost mocking him. He had a busy day ahead, filled with operations that promised to further cement his reputation. The soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Clara, a young nurse who had recently joined the emergency department. Her face was flushed, and there was a tremor in her voice as she spoke. "Dr. Wallace, there's a homeless man in the emergency room. He's in bad shape and needs immediate attention." Wallace waved his hand dismissively, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Clara, we can't treat every unfortunate soul who wanders through our doors. This is a hospital, not a charity. Send him to the shelter." "But doctor, he's struggling to breathe. He might not survive if we don't act quickly," Clara insisted, her eyes wide with concern. "Do you know how many patients we see in a day? We can't save them all. I suggest you focus on those who can actually afford our services," he replied coldly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young nurse shifted uncomfortably, but she knew better than to challenge him further. As she turned to leave, she cast one last glance back at Wallace, a mixture of disappointment and disbelief etched on her face. As Clara hurried away, Wallace returned to his thoughts, dismissing the incident from his mind. He had built his career on hard decisions, ones that often meant prioritizing the wealthy and the powerful. In his eyes, there was no place for the destitute in the sterile hulls of his world. He felt a surge of satisfaction as he recalled the upcoming surgeries, the lives he would save, and the accolades that would follow. In the emergency room, Thomas Carter sat hunched over in one of the worn plastic chairs, his frail body trembling. He struggled to catch his breath, beads of sweat gathering on his brow. The stench of alcohol and neglect surrounded him like a shroud, but his eyes still held a flicker of determination. "Help me," he rasped, reaching out toward the bustling staff. A doctor approached him, concern etched on her features. "Sir, can you tell me how you're feeling?" she asked gently. "Can't breathe, please, I need help," Carter pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. The doctor hesitated, glancing around the room. She knew they were short-staffed and overwhelmed with patients. "We'll get you some oxygen. Just hold on," she said, moving away to gather supplies. But as she turned, she caught sight of Dr. Wallace entering the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The Taijishin bustling activity around them seemed to pause as he walked through the chaos, his eyes scanning the room with an air of superiority. "Doctor, this man needs immediate intervention," the doctor said, her tone anxious as she gestured toward Carter. Wallace looked down at the elderly man, his expression unreadable. "He looks like another homeless man seeking charity," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain. "We don't have the resources to waste on someone who wouldn't even appreciate it." "Jonathan, he's struggling to breathe," the doctor insisted, her frustration boiling over. "We can't just turn him away." "Why not?" Wallace shot back, his gaze unwavering. "We have a responsibility to prioritize our patients. This man doesn't fit that category. He's not worth the time." Carter's eyes widened in shock and hurt as he heard the words. "Please, I'm someone. I just need a chance," he croaked. But his plea fell on deaf ears. Wallace turned away, dismissing him with a flick of his wrist. "Call security if he doesn't leave. We can't have vagrants loitering around here." The elderly man's heart sank, and he felt the weight of despair wash over him. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. I'm not leaving," he gasped, collapsing onto the floor, a pitiful heap of bones and desperation. The doctor rushed to his side, kneeling down to assess the situation. "Get the crash cart," she shouted, fear gripping her voice. But before she could act, Wallace's cold gaze returned to the scene, and he shook his head in frustration. "Stop! This is ridiculous," he said, raising his voice. "He's beyond help. We don't have time for this nonsense. Move on!" As Carter lay there, gasping for breath and fighting against the darkness closing in around him, another doctor, Dr. Emily Hart, stepped forward from the shadows. She had watched the scene unfold with growing horror and felt a surge of compassion. Without waiting for Wallace's permission, she knelt beside Carter, her hands finding his pulse. "He's still alive, Jonathan. He needs help now." Emily's voice was fierce, a stark contrast to the icy indifference of her superior. Wallace's jaw clenched, but he felt the tension in the room shift. The other staff members looked on, their eyes darting between him and Emily, unsure of how to react. In that moment, Wallace was confronted with an undeniable truth. His authority was being challenged, and it was unsettling. "Fine," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "but don't expect me to take responsibility for the outcome. This is a waste of resources." Emily nodded, grateful for her colleagues' reluctant cooperation. "We'll do everything we can," she replied, her focus now solely on Carter. She quickly initiated emergency protocols, her hands steady as she worked to stabilize the elderly. As the chaos of the emergency room continued around them, Dr. Wallace turned on his heel and walked away, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing in his wake. He felt a mixture of annoyance and something else, something he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was a flicker of guilt, or maybe a twinge of doubt about his rigid beliefs. But he quickly buried those thoughts beneath layers of arrogance and pride, choosing instead to focus on the operations that awaited him. As he stepped into the hallway, he allowed himself to feel the familiar rush of superiority. He was the best, and he knew it. But as he walked away from the emergency room, a small part of him couldn't shake the image of the frail man who had begged for help. The man had looked so helpless, so desperate. Yet, in Wallace's world, that desperation was simply a reminder of the line he had drawn between the worthy and the unworthy. What he didn't know was that the echoes of that encounter would soon reverberate throughout his life, unraveling the carefully constructed persona that had brought him success, but had stripped him of humanity. And so Dr. Jonathan Wallace continued on, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, unaware that the choices he made would soon come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. The sun rose lazily the day after the tragic incident, casting a pale light into the boardroom where Dr. Jonathan Wallace sat, his fingers tapping nervously against the polished oak table. He had been summoned to discuss the circumstances surrounding the homeless man's death, an event he had dismissed as inconsequential. Now, with the board members' serious expressions and the tension in the air, Wallace felt an unfamiliar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. "Dr. Wallace," began Thomas Reed, the hospital's chief administrator, breaking the heavy silence. "As you know, we're here to discuss the implications of Mr. Carter's death last night. The board is concerned about the potential fallout." Wallace straightened his tie, a habitual gesture of maintaining control. "I fail to see why his death warrants such grave concern. He was a homeless man. His life had little value in the broader context of our hospital's mission." The murmurs around the table intensified, and Wallace could sense the disapproval radiating from his colleagues. Dr. Emily Chen, a rising star in the surgical department, spoke next, her voice steady, but laced with disappointment. "Jonathan, with all due respect, Thomas Carter was a patient. Regardless of his background, we have an ethical obligation to provide care." "Ethics?" Wallace scoffed, leaning back in his chair as if to distance himself from the conversation. Are we really going to debate the ethics of treating every individual who walks through our doors? This is a hospital, not a charity. We can't afford to waste resources on those who refuse to help themselves. Your view is dangerously narrow, interjected Dr. Reed, his brow furrowing. We're not just discussing ethics. We're talking about potential legal ramifications. Given the circumstances of his death and the public scrutiny that's sure to follow, we must approach this with caution. As the board members continued to discuss strategies for damage control, Wallace's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was inherently wrong about the situation. Why was the death of an insignificant homeless man drawing such attention? Perhaps, he mused, it was simply the media's penchant for sensationalism. They thrived on tragedy, and this was just another story to exploit. The meeting dragged on, with Wallace growing increasingly impatient. He was used to being in control, to being the one making decisions. But now he felt like a pawn on a chessboard, manipulated by the anxieties of others. Finally, he stood up. I have a surgery scheduled. In an hour. I suggest we wrap this up. The hospital cannot afford to be sidetracked by this. As he strode out of the boardroom, he overheard snippets of conversation behind him, words like negligence and lawsuit drifting through the air. They couldn't possibly hold him accountable, he thought. He was Dr. Jonathan Wallace, an esteemed surgeon, untouchable in his domain. The following day, Wallace was jolted from his thoughts by the sharp ring of his phone. It was his secretary, Claire, her voice tinged with urgency. Dr. Wallace, you need to see this. What is it? He snapped, irritation creeping into his tone. There's been a court order for an autopsy on Mr. Carter. They're investigating the circumstances surrounding his death. Wallace felt the color drain from his face. An autopsy? For a homeless man? His voice rose incredulously. Why would they waste resources on that? Sir, it's not just about him being homeless. There's been talk of negligence, and the media is already starting to pick up the story. Media, he echoed, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. What do they want with a dead man? It's not like he was anyone of importance. Perhaps that's the problem, Claire replied cautiously. They're viewing it as a symbol of systemic failure in healthcare. It could turn into a scandal if we're not careful. Wallace slammed his palm on the desk, the sound echoing through his office like a thunderclap. This is absurd. I refuse to be dragged into a circus of public opinion over a man whose existence meant nothing to me or anyone else. Dr. Wallace, please, Claire said, her voice steady yet pleading. I understand your frustration, but we need to prepare ourselves. You may not see it yet, but this could impact your career. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. I will not be held accountable for a decision that was right at the time. The man was already dying when he entered the hospital. I did what any rational person would have done. You may need to reconsider that stance, Claire warned. There's more to this than you realize. Enough, he barked, cutting her off. I won't discuss this further. As he hung up the phone, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. The engraved pocket watch he had seen on Carter's body flashed in his mind, but he brushed it aside, attributing his anxiety to a lack of sleep. What did it matter? The man was dead. Later that evening, Wallace found himself at his favorite downtown restaurant, trying to drown his worries in a glass of expensive wine. The ambiance was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing in his mind. He scanned the room, looking for solace in the familiar faces of affluent patrons, the kind of people who appreciated the nuances of life he had long embraced. Jonathan! A voice cut through his reverie. It was Meredith, a colleague and friend who approached with a smile. Meredith, he greeted, attempting to mask his unease. What brings you here? I was just meeting a few friends, but I couldn't help but notice you look a little out of sorts. Everything okay?" "Fine," he replied curtly, lifting his glass to take another sip. "Just a busy day at the hospital, nothing to worry about." She raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Are you sure? I heard about the homeless man. It's quite the topic of discussion." "Those discussions are irrelevant," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "What does it matter to anyone? He was a nobody." "Jonathan, that's not fair. Every life has value, whether we choose to see it or not." He shot her a sharp glance, unaccustomed to being challenged. "I don't have time for this right now." Meredith sighed, a blend of concern and disappointment washing over her features. "Just think about it, okay? You're better than this." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Wallace alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of unease. He finished his drink in silence, the watchful eyes of the other patrons feeling more intrusive than usual. As he left the restaurant, the weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders. The world outside was alive with noise and movement, but all he felt was a growing sense of isolation. He had always been a man of privilege, a man who had built a fortress around himself. Yet as he stood on the bustling sidewalk, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were beginning to crumble. The engraved pocket watch lingered in his thoughts, a nagging reminder that perhaps he had underestimated the significance of the man whose life he had so carelessly dismissed. Dr. Jonathan Wallace sat in his opulent office the late afternoon, sun casting elongated shadows across the polished mahogany desk. The weight of the legal summons lay before him like a dark cloud, a stark reminder that he was not as untouchable as he had always believed. The embossed letters on the envelope, "State of New York versus Dr. Jonathan Wallace," seemed to mock him. His perfectly manicured fingers traced the edges of the paper, and he scoffed at the absurdity of it all. "Can you believe this?" he muttered to himself, a bitter smile curling his lips. "They think they can bring me down over the death of a homeless man." He leaned back in his leather chair, surveying the opulence of his surroundings, framed degrees, accolades, and a view of the city that underscored his status. In the doorway, his secretary, Linda, stood with an expression that was a mix of concern and anticipation. "Dr. Wallace, the press is starting to catch wind of this. There are rumors flying around." "Let them fly," he replied dismissively, waving a hand as if to swat away an annoying fly. "I've dealt with worse than a few journalists looking for a story. This will blow over in no time." Linda's frown deepened. "But no buts," he interrupted, his voice sharper than intended. "This is an inconvenience, nothing more. I have patients to see and a reputation to uphold." As she turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of her worried expression lingering in the corner of his eye. It was a look he had seen before, one that suggested she was contemplating her own allegiance to his increasingly precarious position. He brushed the thought aside. Loyalty was a commodity he expected, not earned. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave the office, he was met by a colleague, Dr. Emily Vargas. She was a rising star in the surgical department, known for her skill and compassion, two traits that Wallace often scoffed at. "Jonathan," she began, her tone cautious, "have you considered hiring a lawyer? This could escalate quickly." Wallace chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "You think a lawyer will save me? I'm not worried about this. The board will back me. I'm too valuable to lose over a petty issue." "Petty? Jonathan, a man died. You may want to reflect on how you've treated others in the past." Her eyes narrowed, disappointment etched across her features. "Don't lecture me, Emily," he snapped, a flash of anger igniting his voice. "You don't know the pressure I'm under. You haven't walked in my shoes." "Maybe you should try walking in someone else's for a change," she shot back, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in the room. "This isn't just about you anymore." Wallace dismissed her with a wave. "I don't need your advice. I'll handle this my way." He turned on his heel and strode out, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the sterile corridor, leaving Emily with a sense of dread for what lay ahead. The following days blurred into a haze of press conferences, legal meetings, and an increasing sense of scrutiny. As the media swarmed, Wallace found himself facing questions he had never imagined. Reporters camped outside the hospital, their cameras flashing like the strobe lights of a club, and his carefully curated public image began to crack under the weight of their relentless inquiries. Dr. Wallace, how do you respond to accusations of negligence? One reporter shouted as he hurried past, the question laced with venom. Negligence? That's absurd, he retorted, his voice strained but defiant. I have dedicated my life to saving lives, not taking them. As he walked through the hospital halls, whispers followed him. Colleagues exchanged glances, and patients eyed him with distrust. The once adoring respect he had commanded began to morph into disdain. One afternoon, he encountered a familiar face in the break room, Dr. Mark Reynolds, an old friend turned rival. Mark's eyes were filled with a mix of pity and schadenfreude. Tough break, Jonathan. It's a shame what happened. Oh, spare me the sympathy, Wallace snapped, pouring himself a cup of coffee, which he no longer found pleasure in. You think this is about me? It's about that old man and the pathetic life he led. I didn't kill him. Maybe not directly, Mark replied, leaning against the counter, his expression unreadable. But your refusal to extend a helping hand says a lot about you. It's not just your reputation at stake, it's your soul. Wallace clenched his jaw, the bitterness rising like bile in his throat. You don't know anything about me. Mark, you've always been envious of what I've accomplished. Envy? No, Jonathan. I'm worried about you. This could change you if you let it. Change? Wallace echoed, a laugh escaping his lips that was devoid of mirth. I'm not the one who needs to change. The world needs to adapt to the realities of life. Not every life is worth saving. As the days turned into weeks, the trial loomed closer. Wallace stood before the courthouse, the air thick with tension. A throng of reporters lined the steps, microphones thrust toward him like weapons. He forced a smile, projecting an image of confidence he didn't feel. Dr. Wallace, how do you plan to defend yourself? A reporter called out, their voice piercing through the commotion. I plan to present the facts. I did not know that man. His circumstances are not my fault, he replied, his voice steady but strained. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged, electric with anticipation. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the start of proceedings. Wallace sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by his legal team, who were whispering strategies and preparing their case. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Thompson, rose to address the court, her voice calm yet commanding. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear evidence that will show the arrogance and negligence of Dr. Wallace, a man who has forgotten the oath he took to save lives. Wallace shifted in his seat, his palms sweaty against the polished wood of the table, but he forced himself to maintain an air of indifference. This is just theatrics, he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself of his own bravado. As witnesses took the stand, the narrative began to unfurl, a collage of testimonies revealing Wallace's cold demeanor and dismissive attitude toward those he deemed unworthy of his care. Each recounting chipped away at the wall of pride he had built around himself, exposing the raw vulnerability he had long buried. Dr. Wallace, can you explain your decision to refuse treatment to Thomas Carter? Claire asked, her gaze unwavering. Wallace opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the jury's eyes upon him, each one a reminder of his past transgressions. The arrogance he had once worn like a badge of honor felt increasingly fragile. I believed he was beyond help, he finally stammered, the conviction in his voice faltering. I didn't think he would respond to treatment. And that belief was based on what exactly? Claire pressed, her tone relentless. His appearance, his... Wallace faltered, the realization dawning upon him that he was defending his prejudice. I didn't believe he had the will to recover. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and for the first time Wallace felt vulnerable, exposed. The facade he had maintained for so long began to crumble, revealing the man beneath the doctor, a man who had lost sight of the very essence of his profession. As the trial progressed, he realized that this was not just about defending his actions. It was a reckoning with the man he had become. Each testimony pulled him deeper into a reflection he had long avoided. He was not just a surgeon. He was a man who had turned his back on compassion, and now the consequences were laid bare for all to see. With every word spoken, the weight of his arrogance pressed down heavier on his chest, suffocating the pride that had once defined him. The realization that he could no longer hide behind his status or his achievements became increasingly clear. Here, in this courtroom, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Dr. Jonathan Wallace was forced to confront the truth, one he had long evaded. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation as Dr. Jonathan Wallace sat rigidly in his seat. The judge's gavel had just struck, quieting the murmurs, and now all eyes were fixed on the opposing counsel, a sharp and determined lawyer named Sarah Mitchell. With an intensity that could cut through steel, she stood to deliver what would become the most shocking revelation of the trial. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady, "I present to you a truth that Dr. Wallace would prefer to keep buried, a truth that reveals the depths of his indifference and arrogance." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. As she reached into her briefcase, Wallace's heart raced. He felt a chill run down his spine, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He had always been in control, an indomitable force in the world of medicine, and yet here he was, vulnerable before a jury of his peers. Thomas Carter, she continued, pulling out a faded photograph, was not just a homeless man. He was a former medical professor and a co-founder of this very hospital. She held the photograph high, revealing an image of a younger Thomas, standing proudly alongside other founders, beaming with a sense of purpose and vision. The courtroom erupted in gasps, and Wallace felt the heat rise to his cheeks as the implications of Mitchell's words hit him like a tidal wave. How could this be, he thought, his mind racing back to the moments he had dismissed Carter as nothing more than a nuisance. He could hardly breathe, the walls of the courtroom closing in around him. The whispers grew louder, and he could sense the judgment in the eyes of those who once looked up to him, who once revered him as a paragon of medical excellence. Mitchell continued, "Dr. Wallace's refusal to treat Mr. Carter was not merely an act of negligence. It was a betrayal of everything this hospital stands for. He turned his back on a man who dedicated his life to saving others." She turned to face Wallace directly, her gaze piercing through his carefully constructed facade. "And the reason? Because he deemed Mr. Carter unworthy of his time." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Wallace squirmed in his seat, the realization crashing over him like a storm. The man he had so callously dismissed was not just a stranger. He was part of his own bloodline, a connection he had severed long before he even knew it existed. "What do you have to say for yourself, Dr. Wallace?" Mitchell's voice cut through his thoughts, her challenge clear. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain the unexplainable, the walls he had built around his heart, the disdain he felt for the very concept of weakness? As he sat there, the silence grew heavier, filling the gaps where his arrogance once thrived. "Your Honor," Wallace finally managed to say, his voice shaking, "I had no idea who he was." The words felt hollow, even to himself. He was grasping at straws, desperately trying to maintain his dignity in the face of overwhelming evidence against him. I believed I was making a choice based on medical ethics, not realizing the man before me was part of my family. Is that really your defense, Dr. Wallace? Mitchell pressed, her tone laced with skepticism. Is ignorance a valid excuse for negligence? How can you reconcile your past actions with the fact that you denied help to a man who was not only a pioneer in medicine but also your grandfather? The courtroom erupted once again, this time in a cacophony of outrage. The jurors exchanged incredulous glances, and Wallace felt the weight of their judgment. He was no longer the esteemed surgeon he had prided himself on being. He was a man exposed, stripped of his defenses. Enough! The judge's voice boomed, commanding silence. Dr. Wallace, you are aware of the gravity of this situation. The jury will consider your past actions in light of this new evidence. You have a family connection to the deceased that changes everything. Your Honor, Wallace began, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. Your defense will be presented in due time, the judge said, his expression stern. For now, we will take a recess. As the gavel struck once more, Wallace felt his world tilt. He clutched the edges of the table, breathing heavily as the room emptied around him. His mind raced with thoughts of Thomas Carter, the grandfather he never knew he had. The man's life had been filled with purpose, yet he had ended up in the streets, begging for help while Wallace had thrived in a world of privilege and prestige. He could hear the hushed conversations of the jurors, their whispers like daggers slicing through his pride. He didn't even know who he was. One juror said, incredulity lacing her voice. How could he be so cold? Wallace felt a surge of anger mixed with shame. He wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, to defend himself against accusations that felt so far removed from the man he wanted to believe he was. But deep down, he knew he had failed, not just Thomas, but himself. In the corridor outside, the courtroom, he leaned against the cold wall, his hands trembling. The world felt surreal, as if he were watching a movie unfold that featured a character who was nothing like him. He was a man of science, of precision, a man who had built his career on saving lives. Yet here he was, consumed by the realization that he had let a life slip away, one that was intertwined with his own. Dr. Wallace? A voice broke through his reverie. It was his lawyer, Mark, who approached with a look of concern etched across his face. We need to strategize. This revelation changes everything. Wallace nodded, but his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Mark, I didn't know. I didn't know who he was. His voice trailed off, the weight of his guilt crashing down upon him once more. I understand, Mark replied gently, putting a hand on Wallace's shoulder. But we need to focus on how to move forward. You need to show the jury that you're not the man they think you are. Can I? Wallace asked, doubt creeping into his voice. How do I prove that I'm not just a monster? By taking responsibility, Mark said firmly. You need to own your actions, Jonathan. This is a moment for humility, not arrogance. Wallace looked into Mark's eyes, searching for a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. Perhaps this was his chance to change, to confront the man he had become. But could he really face the consequences of his past? As they walked back into the courtroom, Wallace's heart raced. The path before him was fraught with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. He could no longer hide in the shadows of his own making. The truth was out, and it was a time to face it. As he took his seat once more, the jury returned, their expressions serious and contemplative. Wallace felt his breath quicken. The moment of reckoning was upon him. He could sense the weight of their scrutiny, their judgment hanging heavily in the air. Dr. Wallace, the judge said, his voice steady, we will now resume the proceedings. It is time for you to address the court. Wallace straightened, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he had to confront the consequences of his actions, to grapple with the man he had been, and to find a way to forge a new path forward. The eyes of the courtroom were upon him, and for the first time he felt exposed, stripped of the armor he had worn for so long. The time for indifference was over. It was time to confront his past, and perhaps to embrace the possibility of redemption. The courtroom was a tempest of emotions, and Dr. Jonathan Wallace could feel the weight of the gavel as if it were a physical force pressing down on him. The walls, once a comforting shade of beige, now seemed to close in, painted with the whispers of the jurors and the murmurs of the public. As he stood at the defendant's table, his heart raced, a rhythm of panic that matched the rapid cadence of his thoughts. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, to dissect each case and each patient with surgical precision. But now, in the face of damning evidence and his own past, he felt like a man on the verge of collapse. "Dr. Wallace," the prosecutor's voice sliced through his thoughts, "you claim you had no knowledge of Mr. Carter's identity, correct?" The prosecutor leaned forward, a subtle smirk revealing the confidence of someone who knew he held the upper hand. "That is correct," Wallace replied, trying to maintain the cool detachment that had defined him throughout his career. "I treated him as I would treat any patient, based on their medical needs, not their history." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were savoring a particularly delectable morsel. "And yet, you had the power to save him, to extend compassion to a fellow human being. You chose to turn him away. Why?" The question hung in the air, pregnant with implications. Wallace shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing to find the right words, the right defense. "Because this hospital is not a charity," he retorted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I cannot treat every person who walks through those doors without regard for the system we have in place." The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, interjected, "Dr. Wallace, are you suggesting that your professional ethics permit you to disregard a patient's life based on their social status?" The tension in the room escalated, and Wallace felt the piercing gazes of the jurors. He could sense their skepticism, their judgment. They were beginning to lean away from him, and he could almost hear the whispers of doubt echoing in their minds. The gavel struck the table, and he knew he was losing ground. As the prosecutor continued his line of questioning, Wallace's thoughts drifted to his mother. He hadn't spoken to her in years, not since he had left home to pursue his medical career. She had often warned him about the dangers of pride and arrogance, about the importance of family. But he had dismissed her words as quaint, relics of a bygone era. Now those lessons echoed in his mind, haunting him. Suddenly, the courtroom door swung open, and a figure stepped inside. It was his mother, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes fierce with determination. Her presence was enough to silence the room, and all eyes turned toward her. Wallace's heart sank as he recognized the urgency in her expression. "Jonathan," she called, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to speak with you now." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the interruption, but she nodded her consent. Wallace felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she had come to defend him, to remind the court of the man he once was. "Mother, I'm in the middle of a trial," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "What could possibly be so important?" "It's about Thomas Carter," she said, her voice low but urgent. "You need to know the truth." The prosecutor glanced at the judge, who waved him off, allowing the conversation to continue. "What truth?" Wallace asked, confusion clouding his mind. "Thomas Carter was your grandfather," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it reverberated through the courtroom like a thunderclap. "He was your father's father." Wallace felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The walls of the courtroom began to blur, the faces of the jurors distorted by shock. He stumbled back a step, his breath caught in his throat. "No, that can't be true. I would have known. Jonathan, please." His mother's voice cracked. "Your father left when you were young. He cut ties with the family. You never knew because he wanted you to forget. But Thomas cared about you. He loved you, even from a distance." The revelation crashed over him like a wave, dragging him under. All the pride he had built up, the walls he had constructed around his heart, crumbled into dust. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, suffocating. How could he have turned away a man who was family? How could he have been so blind? The courtroom, once a place of power for him, now felt like a cage. "Your Honor," he gasped, turning to the judge. "I need a moment." The judge regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and sternness. "Very well, but be quick about it." Wallace stepped away from the table, retreating to a corner of the courtroom. He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to stave off the tidal wave of emotions threatening to engulf him. Memories of his childhood, of stories his mother told him about family, now took on a new painful light. He had spent years distancing himself from his roots, convinced that he could rise above his past, only to discover that he had been rejecting a part of himself. "Jonathan," his mother said softly, approaching him. "You have to face this. You can't run away anymore." "I didn't know," he whispered, anguish spilling from his lips. "I didn't know he was my grandfather. If I had..." "You might have acted differently," she finished for him, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But you can't change the past. All you can do is choose how to move forward." The words hung in the air, and, for the first time, Wallace felt the heavy shackles of arrogance begin to loosen. He had spent so long viewing the world through a lens of superiority, believing that compassion was a weakness. Now, with the truth unspooled in front of him, he understood that true strength lay in vulnerability, in acknowledging one's flaws. Returning to the courtroom, he felt different. The audience was still, the tension palpable as they awaited his next move. He faced the jury, his voice steadier than before. "I may have acted out of ignorance, but ignorance is no excuse for negligence. I failed to see the humanity in my grandfather, and for that I am truly sorry." The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting as they processed his admission. The prosecutor's confidence wavered, and for the first time, Wallace felt a sense of clarity amidst the chaos. He was no longer just a surgeon defending his reputation. He was a man confronting the consequences of his actions, determined to seek redemption for his past mistakes. As he spoke, the gravity of his failure settled into his bones, but so too did the dawning realization that perhaps this was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to finally embrace the compassion he had long denied. The atmosphere in Dr. Jonathan Wallace's once sterile office felt heavy with the weight of his guilt. The smell of antiseptic lingered, a stark reminder of the countless lives he had saved and the single life he had recklessly discarded. Suspended from his position, Wallace found himself drowning in a sea of remorse, his mind racing through memories of the hospital, the patients he had treated, and, most hauntingly, the moment he turned away Thomas Carter. In the days that followed the revelation of Carter's identity, Wallace sought refuge in the past, sifting through a box of old letters tucked away in the attic of his childhood home. Each letter was a testament to a man he barely knew, yet whose blood coursed through his veins. The letters painted a portrait of a compassionate man, a grandfather who had dedicated his life to helping others. With each word, Wallace felt the chasm between them widen, filled with regret and shame. "Jonathan," he whispered to himself, his voice echoing in the empty room, "what have you done?" As he read, the words seemed to pierce his heart. "Dear Jonathan," one letter began, "I hope you are finding joy in your work. Remember that every life you touch is a precious gift. The lines blurred as tears pooled in his eyes. The letters were filled with advice, love, and the hope that his grandson would one day understand the value of compassion in medicine. "Why didn't I listen?" he muttered, crumbling the letter in his fist. The guilt was a living thing, tightening around his chest, making it hard to breathe. Wallace knew he had to act. He had to find a way to redeem himself. The idea of volunteering at a free clinic flickered in his mind, a chance to put into practice the lessons he had neglected for so long. It was a radical shift from his previous life, one he had scoffed at and looked down upon. But now he felt compelled to step into that world, to confront the very people he had once dismissed. The next day, he walked into the clinic with trepidation, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The waiting room was filled with people from all walks of life, each one staring at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The doctor who ran the clinic, a young man named David, eyed him warily, and Wallace could sense the tension in the air. "What are you doing here?" David asked, arms crossed, his tone defensive. "I'm here to volunteer," Wallace replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I want to help." David studied him for a moment, skepticism etched across his face. "This isn't a place for people like you. You have a reputation. Are you trying to play the hero?" Wallace felt the sting of David's words. He was the last person anyone would expect to see in a place like this. "I know I have a past," he said, his voice low. "But I want to change. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "Prove it," David challenged. "You'll start in the waiting room, and I'll assign you tasks as I see fit, but don't expect any special treatment." Wallace nodded, accepting the challenge. He spent the first few days in the clinic organizing files, helping patients complete paperwork, and listening to their stories. It was a humbling experience. Each patient brought with them a narrative filled with pain, hope, and resilience. There was Maria, a single mother struggling to make ends meet, and James, an elderly man who had lost the will to live after his wife's passing. "Doctor," Maria said one day as she sat in the waiting room, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, "I know this isn't a fancy hospital, but I need help for my son. He's been sick for weeks, and I don't know what to do." Wallace felt a pang of empathy as he listened to her plight. "We'll do everything we can to help him," he assured her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Through these encounters, he began to feel the stirrings of redemption. Each small act of kindness chipped away at the wall he had built around himself. Weeks turned into months, and the weight of his guilt began to lift. He found himself becoming more engaged, not just as a volunteer, but as a person ready to embrace the humanity of those around him. David, initially skeptical, began to soften, recognizing Wallace's genuine desire to change. "You've got a long way to go," he said one afternoon as they cleaned the clinic together, "but I see you trying." "I appreciate that," Wallace replied, a sense of camaraderie building between them. "I didn't understand how important this work was until I was forced to confront my own failures." As the months passed, Wallace's reputation began to shift. The media frenzy that once surrounded him faded, replaced by whispers of a doctor who had humbled himself, a man who was willing to learn from his mistakes. His heart swelled with a sense of purpose he had never known before. Finally, the day came for Wallace to return to the courtroom. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. As he walked in, he felt the weight of the gazes upon him, some filled with disdain, others with curiosity. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, looked at him over her glasses. "Dr. Wallace," she began, her voice steady, "you have been given a unique opportunity for redemption. You stand before this court not just as a medical professional, but as a man who has learned the true meaning of responsibility." Wallace swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Your Honor," he said, his voice gaining strength, I accept my guilt. I failed, not only my profession but also my family. I can't change the past, but I am committed to making amends in every way I can." The judge nodded, her expression softening slightly. "In light of your efforts to serve the community and the changes you've made, I am willing to reinstate your medical license. However, this will come with conditions. You will serve at a public hospital under the supervision of a qualified physician. You will continue to learn the values of compassion and humility." "Thank you, Your Honor," Wallace said, a wave of relief washing over him. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of David in the audience, standing with a young woman. The moment their eyes met, Wallace realized the woman was the nurse who had saved Thomas Carter. "Dr. Wallace," David said, stepping forward, "I want you to meet my mother, Sarah." The nurse's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no malice, only an intensity born from the pain of the past. "You're the one who turned away." "My father," she said, her voice steady. "I know," Wallace replied, feeling the weight of her gaze, "and I've spent every day since regretting that decision. I can't change what happened, but I'm here to honor his legacy and make things right." For a moment, silence hung between them, a shared understanding forming in the space where anger once resided. "I hope you truly mean that," Sarah finally said, her expression softening. "Because my father believed in the power of redemption. He would want to see you succeed." As Wallace left the courtroom, the burden of his past felt lighter. He had embarked on a journey of transformation, one that intertwined his fate with those he had once overlooked. In that moment, he understood that true greatness was not measured by accolades or status, but by the ability to connect with others, to show kindness, and to embrace the shared humanity that binds us all. With renewed purpose, Dr. Jonathan Wallace stepped into the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he would walk this path with compassion as his guide.